All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Clean Water Conversations, formerly named the Clean Water Lecture Series. My name is Rachel McKimmey, and I am an AmeriCorps member serving at the Department of Environmental Conservation. The Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation's Clean Water Initiative Program, CWIP, or CWIP, has just released an updated State Fiscal Year 2023 funding policy, which sets guidelines on the appropriate use of CWIP-administered funds. The CWIP funding policy applies to a subset of CWIP-administered funding programs. This afternoon, we will hear from Gianna Petito, CWIP Grants Coordinator. Gianna will provide an overview of some of the major changes that accompany the updated funding policy. Our next lecture will take place on Thursday, February 9th at noon. You can join us to hear an overview of Vermont's clean water progress from 2016 to 2022 from the Clean Water Program's 2022 Performance Report. Keep a lookout for more information on how to attend this event. You can sign up for our Clean Water newsletter to keep up to date on other events happening in the clean water world. I will provide a link in the chat later. This lecture will feature a 30-minute presentation with question and answers at the end. You can ask questions by using the chat at any time during the presentation. We would like to respect everyone's time and end before 1 p.m. We will start by asking questions from the chat, and then if time allows, let people unmute and ask questions out loud. If you would like to verbally ask a question, you can use the raise hand function, and we can call on you. At that time, you can unmute and speak. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. I'll provide a link for that as well. Here, I would like to pass it over to Gianna.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm gonna share my screen so folks are looking at what I am looking at. And thank you so much, Rachel, for coordinating our Clean Water Conversation series. It's so great to be part of this. And thank you all for joining us today on this exciting topic of our new funding policy and key changes. As Rachel mentioned, we are recording this, so any text-heavy slides, you can refer back to them. And a quick mention in the title page, this is CWIP's SFY 2023 funding policy. That stands for State Fiscal Year. Our fiscal years begin in July and then go through the following June. It's a naming convention. It doesn't necessarily just apply to grants for this fiscal year. It's sort of just the fiscal year that the funding policy is released, just for awareness. So thank you so much for joining. I am the grants coordinator for the Clean Water Initiative program, have been so for about 1.5 to 2 years. And before this position, I was serving as the district manager for the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District, designing and implementing many of the projects that we currently fund. My role in this, my responsibilities in this role are really to oversee the funding policy and its updates, as well as oversee the development of our spending plan, which provides the public some insights into how we expect to spend the money allocated to us from the Clean Water Board. Our agenda for today, we'll start with sort of a brief overview of who is CWIP or CWIP. What do we mean when we talk about clean water projects and our CWIP grants? Just the CWIP funding policy, why do we have it, and where can you find resources related to it? And then hopefully spend the majority of the conversation today talking about a summary of some of the key major changes that have come out with this new funding policy in comparison to our State Fiscal Year 21 funding policy. Wrap up with a few next steps and leave some time for a question and answer at the end. So to start off with, who is CWIP or CWIP? This is our evolving and somewhat new mission statement, but we aim to efficiently, effectively, and equitably align and coordinate clean water efforts statewide, develop financial and technical resources to implement projects, and capture and assess that data to communicate the progress and impact of clean water efforts. We are part of the bureaucratic alphabet soup. If it's helpful for any of you, we're in WID, DEC, and ANR. That's Water Investment Division, Department of Environmental Conservation, Agency of Natural Resources. And the Clean Water Initiative does exist in statute. And so we have provided in the chat, thanks Rachel for your help, a link to our website a link to the statutory language that launches the Clean Water Initiative, and a link to more information about Vermont's water quality standards. But in statute, one of the purposes of the Clean Water Initiative is to provide the financing necessary to help the state achieve and maintain compliance with Vermont's water quality standards. And clearly by the picture, we're passionate intent of water quality and Vermont's water quality standards by managing grants that support what we call clean water projects. And this is just some pictures, a range of clean water projects that can across a whole bunch of sectors. So we fund improvements to roads, stormwater, wetlands restoration projects, dam removals, agricultural projects. So it's really the whole gambit of stuff that might have an impact on water quality. So you can see folks here planting riparian buffers. This is a dam removal project on the bottom right, to drainage improvements and stormwater green rain gardens and parking lots. So it's really a range of stuff when we talk about that. And we sometimes talk about different project types or sectors in our lingo as well. So we do have different grant programs that fund different sort of phases of these projects. This is a real small snapshot of a table that we do have on our website. The link to the full website, the link to this table is going to be provided in the chat. But our spending plan, which is another link we're providing, will give you the full suite of everything we fund. But this is sort of a snapshot of the more project-focused funding programs that we provide. And you can see we have a dam removal one, we have fund project development work, we fund woody riparian buffer work. So going to this site page is a great way to stay up to date on what's currently available. And we fund a range of stuff from regulatory work, supporting schools that have to meet their 3-acre improvements, stormwater improvements, so regulatory projects, to voluntary projects, and sort of everything in between, sometimes a little bit of both. And the spending plan is really the best source for you to know where are we going to put new dollars next year for some of these programs. But what I want to highlight in terms of the funding policy is what's highlighted in green, which is what we're now calling funding program administrators. So DEC more and more so is moving towards this funding program administrator model. And what do we mean by that? And it's just an important nuance for when we talk about like how to apply for grants. Traditionally, we had what a lot of you may be familiar with is our ecosystem restoration project grants or program grants. And that's really sort of defined by this line A in this diagram, where we would review all these individual projects and sort of select them for funding and give direct money. More and more so as the Clean Water Fund and the Clean Water budget has grown, a lot more interest and capacity on the ground has grown. We've really transitioned to using these funding program administrators. You might be familiar with the term block grant. So more and more so we're leaning on this for a lot of our programs, where we give money to entities who then review individual projects and select them using sort of their own processes for having a selection committee and a prioritization process. So this dynamic is really important as to why we use the funding policy. It's really one of the main reasons is to project to project implementers on the ground and funding program administrators how we would have selected projects and how they should select projects on behalf of DEC. So it's a really key component of why we have the policy. So that gets us to the why. The new funding policy does list out some purposes of the funding policy. So there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read all of it. But the point is there's a lot of things we're trying to achieve with this intent. We receive these dollars, they are Clean Water Fund dollars. There's a statutory intent behind them. We receive them from the Clean Water Board. The Clean Water Board has an intent behind the use of those dollars. So we design a lot of our programs to make sure that it meets that intent, it meets equity issues, it helps us, whatever deliverables we need to report back out. All of those are important. But again, all of those are things that we would use to make our decisions. And then we use this funding policy to help our funding program administrators make similar decisions or the same decisions, because they're now making those funding decisions on behalf of DEC. So that's a big picture as to why we use this document. What about the where? Where are some key resources that you'd want to, where you can find the funding policy and associated resources? And we'll pop these 2 links in the chat for you too. The first is our grants landing page. You'll find the funding policy there. You'll find a PDF summary of funding policy updates and clarifications. So that's a document that I'm sure it'll be really exciting to read through. The summary is a brief 11 pages. It doesn't replace reading the full policy, but it is trying to highlight at a sort of chronological order what are some of the key changes for you. There's also going to be a question and answer document there. We're accepting questions. We will continue to accept questions over time, but we're asking folks to send any immediate ones in by the end of this month, and we'll start to create a Q&A document that we can post on the website there. This is another place you will find a recording of today's presentation. One step further down into our grants resources page, again, you will find the funding policy, and you will find 2 additional resources, a PDF fillable eligibility screening form and an Excel spreadsheet, the project types table. And then you will also find the old funding policy. There are some open grants where the old funding policy applies, and it might be helpful as a reference for folks as you're doing a cross comparison too. So these are 2 links and sites where you can find a lot of resources associated with the funding policy. So now on to the summary of key changes. And again, this is not to totally replace reading the funding policy, and it is not a one-for-one with the PDF that's on there, but more I tried to organize this thematically for you all. I think some of the most pertinent changes or salient changes for today's presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about some structural changes to the document and the additional resources so you can feel oriented, hopefully. There is a narrowed applicability of what the funding policy applies to. We'll talk about that. We've broadened the eligible project purpose, so we'll talk about that. We've also broadened eligibility of projects and expenses, so we'll highlight some of those for you. We made an attempt at alignment and simplification where possible. I know it is a longer document, but it is hopefully simpler through a lot of things. So we'll talk about some areas where we've tried to make some changes there. There's an addition of supporting educational content, so I'll point to where those are in the document. There's a very new section on Vermont Division for Historic Preservation Review, so I'll point to that. We will have a separate training on that. I'll talk briefly about it today. And then there are some shifts in how we're defining one of the eligibility screens, in particular, the natural resource impacts one. So we wanted to sort of highlight some some changes there, and again, pointing to projected future training on that topic. So that's an outline of what we'll talk through today. So to start off with, structurally, there are some totally new appendices. So the first is this project eligibility screening form. This is a screening form that we have used traditionally in our design implementation block grants. It was not part of the funding policy, and the screening questions didn't necessarily align with the eligibility in the funding policy. We've overhauled it so it does align, so it's a one-for-one cross-check. You can look at the funding policy, you can look at the eligibility criteria, and it should be one-to-one with this form. We've made it a separate PDF fillable form available on that site page we just provided for you. So hopefully that'll be a little bit clearer as folks are walking through what projects really are eligible to receive these funds. In the past, we had both a project types table and a milestone and deliverable table. They were both different appendices in a PDF. They had some inconsistencies, so we decided to merge them and make them into an Excel. So the project types table is now a definition of the project type, the performance measures, the milestones, the deliverables, all in one piece, and separated, again, linked on a site page, not actually in the document. It's an Excel table, hopefully with more alignment across project phases. In that Excel table, there's a ton of words you'll see bolded, and that is created Appendix C, which is an explanation of items. So anything bolded in the project types table will be further defined, further resources, further information in Appendix C. So that's hopefully making that a little bit more understandable what the project type table is referring to when it mentions a certain deliverable or a certain template to be used. There are new sections of the funding policy, like the grant recipient responsibilities and guidance, the budget definitions and guidance, and Appendix D, affectionately called other information or bucket information. One of the driving factors of creating these other sections is we tried to pull out from the eligibility criteria all of that supporting guidance and really make the eligibility criteria the clear yes, no's, the clear decision points, but other important information, other important guidance and policy still in the funding policy, but not in sort of the yes, no eligibility criteria. So sort of the evolution of these other sections. And then you'll see that the spending plan is no longer in there. The spending plan is really updated on a different time scale. And so we decided those are now separate documents and not referenced in the funding policy, or referenced in the funding policy, but not included each year. So those are some structural ones, hopefully to help you feel a little bit more oriented. This is the direct language that's near the beginning of the funding policy that talks about the narrowed applicability. Older funding policies applied to every spending initiative in our spending plan. Again, you can see a link to the spending plan there. Now we've decided to narrow the funding policy to really more on the project type focused funding programs that we manage. So this lists them here. And please do note that some of these are open existing block grants or grant agreements. They have reference to older funding policies. Those continue to hold true. So we're not superseding any grant agreement language that you might have. If your grant agreement does refer to an older policy specifically, like the State Fiscal Year 21 funding policy, that one is the one that you'll be held to, not necessarily this new one. If your grant agreement says current funding policy, this would be the new expectation. Moving on to eligibility sections, we've broadened the project purpose. We heard it was very challenging to say what a primary purpose of a project is, particularly these clean water projects that have so many amazing co-benefits.
Hey,
and
Thomas.
where folks are really... Oh,
good.
What?
How's it going?
I think we just need to mute someone. There's so many co-benefits and so many potential.
Gianna, you're muted now too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Gianna, I accidentally muted everybody.
That's okay. So
Sorry
we just,
about that.
point being, that's no worries. Thank you, Rachel. We removed the reference to primary, and we also, the project no longer has to focus only on nutrient and sediment pollution. Given the changes under Act 76, the creation of new funding programs like the Water Quality Enhancement Grant Program, whose purpose was not specifically nutrient and sediment pollution, we really had to broaden what we consider a clean water project and what the purpose of it was. So we tied it much more closely to our statutory purpose, which is achieving and maintaining compliance with the Vermont water quality standards, and now say that the a purpose of the project needs to address at least one of these 4 objectives within the Vermont surface water management strategy. And as you can see, it's above and beyond nutrient and sediment pollution. We also expanded eligibility of projects and expenses. The stormwater roads gully is a new project type, which you will see in the project types table. This was created to very explicitly distinguish it from gully improvement work that might be happening in the stream or in a river. This is really critical in terms because the methods are quite different. We don't want folks rip-wrapping our stream systems, and so that's an ineligible practice. In a stormwater gully that is disconnected and not actually part of a river or stream system, rip-wrapping may be part of the stabilization technique. So we really wanted to make sure that those are clear and distinct project types. But we do rely on the Rivers program to tell us whether it's part of the network or not. So you'll see some more guidance in Appendix D. They're going to be investing in stabilizing a gully to also be addressing the upstream stormwater flow. So this shouldn't really be a standalone project type, but you'll see more of that definition in there. You will see, or you will not see, private roads and driveways as an ineligible project anymore. They are now eligible as a project type and should follow the roads project type definition, bringing up private roads and driveways to the municipal general roads permit standards. And we heard that this was really a critical missing piece of funding and a critical source of particularly nutrient and sediment pollution in certain areas. We do ask, we don't have road erosion inventories on private roads the way we had on municipal roads. And that's actually a key way that we measure some of the improvements that have happened. And so please note, if you are doing those sorts of projects, there's going to be a pre and post construction assessment needed. And that's written in as a milestone and a deliverable in the roads project type now, particularly to address the lack of these regional private road inventories having happened. Equipment and tools are now an eligible expense, confusingly written as ineligible unless the purpose of it is for a clean water project implementation or operation and maintenance. There are some additional requirements around that. There's some definitions about what is a tool versus equipment, and there are some requirements for following DEC's equipment retention policy. So please make sure you take a look at those pieces in Appendix D and in the ineligible expenses list. And in Funding Policy 21, there was sort of an introductory statement in the ineligible expenses that said any expenses that go above and beyond the clean water purpose, the co-benefits, should be funded elsewhere. That's been removed. So co-benefits are now an eligible expense. This was really in recognition of the value that co-benefits can bring to a project, and particularly the ability for this to help us achieve some of our JEDI goals as a state as well. So it felt critical to make these eligible expenses under this. So alignment and simplification, there was a lot of approach and effort to try and align different definitions and standards and simplify processes where possible. So this is sort of a smattering of examples of this, and hopefully sort of reasoning why you might be seeing this in the new funding policy. One example is that the batch import file or the new project form is integrated into more project types. Initially, it was used just as sort of the end of an assessment, where a lot of new projects have been identified, and the batch import file would be a way to get those projects into our database. But we recognize that each new project phase needs a new identification number, and they weren't consistently getting created as a project moved from assessment to preliminary design to final design to implementation. So that was baked in now as a standard deliverable for all those interim phases, so that it's sort of a consistent expectation. Folks can get funded to do it and get it sorted. And so hopefully it's more likely that all these projects will have their identification numbers if and when the next phase is ready to happen. We've integrated DEC programmatic staff engagement as a standard milestone for certain project types. You'll see that in the design phases for the rivers and the streams and the wetlands project types. We asked for that sort of engagement before, and now we've really sort of explicitly put it as a milestone and deliverable there. We try to align the definitions within a project sector. So for example, a roads project sector, from preliminary design to final design to implementation, the definition is as similar as we could across those phases. And we also said, okay, across sectors, like a roads project, a stormwater project, a wetlands project, if you're all doing final design, there should be some standardization in what the milestones look like and the deliverables look like. So we tried to do that. So I think some of the milestones and deliverables might look very different for some folks, or not so different for others. That's some of the intention of those changes there. We went through all the deliverables and tried to cross out and delete as much as possible any reference to interim reporting. We really wanted to cut back on requirements for what might be considered busy work or additional load on the partners, and really emphasize more what are the deliverables we need to make sure the projects are being completed and we're getting the data we need for our performance report. The step 4, we'll dig into a little bit more, but one thing that we tried to emphasize is Step 4, the eligibility criteria for natural resource impacts has a lot of requests for folks to touch base with permitting staff and document all of those interactions. And we made really clear and explicit in this that if you've already gone through an earlier design phase, you've already done a permitting needs assessment, that can replace this. You don't need to sort of duplicate effort or replicate effort. We'll accept, feedback from these folks up to a year or whatnot, so you don't have to go through that again. And recognizing we're in a new century, media announcements no longer need to be press releases. Sometimes that might be an additional cost for folks. So if you were already announcing your projects on social media, those are now an acceptable piece to report back. lot of supporting educational content. We tried to make clear in it where it was just optional versus where it's actually expected to be followed policy and guidance. There's a little section on managing project spending. There's clarity, hopefully, around leveraging and match. We got a lot of questions from folks. We get questions quite frequently about the use of our funds for match. And so we put some more language in there and we welcome questions on it. There are standard deliverables. There's something called a final design report and a preliminary design report. That's always been a deliverable for a lot of our project types. They continue to be them. But in Appendix C, we now provide suggested content for those. They are optional content really to help project implementers plan around what is the information that might be useful to gather and summarize in a final design report in terms of project planning and getting all the information we would need to know about a project. And then finally, Appendix C, there's more information. I'm sorry, Appendix D, there's more information about the Watershed Projects Database and a whole section on project phasing terminology and more design guidance, hopefully for anyone that might be new to the field, like what to expect, what they might want to bake in when they're doing some project planning. There is a whole section about Vermont Division for Historic Preservation Review. Or VDHP. So VDHP is authorized under state statute to perform regulatory review on all projects that involve state funding. So this has been an expectation for state funded projects to go through VDHP review, but we've never really made it very explicit in our milestones or what we expect from our partners. So this update really clarifies that this is a requirement and integrates the review process into our standards and milestones and deliverables. It also tries to create very clear pathways for exempt projects, conditionally exempt project types, and clarify that all of the expenses related to this would be eligible with these funds as well. We are coordinating additional training on this new content March 8th, 2 to 3:30. We've announced in our grants notification listserv. We will send around reminders as well. But please do plan to attend that. It's very new content for all of us, and it'll be quite a good learning experience. This does apply now for projects if you're asking for funding from funding programs where this funding policy applies. So, for example, clean water service providers have formula grant money, water quality restoration formula grant money, where this funding policy applies. So if your project is asking for money for implementation, you need to have done this review. And if you haven't, we're asking partners to make project development funding or other funding available so that you can catch up to make sure that we're investing in projects that have gone through this review appropriately. Very near the end here, I see our time is running short. The natural resource impacts criteria has changed slightly into this permittability concept. In the older policy, there was a request for folks to both talk to permitting staff, but also talk to programmatic staff like the river scientists to get a sense of, from both cohorts, would their project have a natural resource impact? We've narrowed this to really just focus on the permitting staff, and it's the position of the agency that permitting programs are established to mitigate impacts from natural resources. So we've removed programmatic staff from this eligibility screening process. They are still part of the milestones, as you'll see. We still expect and request project proponents to have a strong dialogue with them and engage with them, but they've been removed from this eligibility criteria. The orange box is sort of what's the same. This whole step 4 still has a guiding question of when a permit might apply for you, who you should talk to. Please tell us who you talk to. And then the green section is sort of the new addition. It's served as a summary table at the bottom that says, okay, what did you learn? What are some of the concerns? What are you going to do in your project to make sure you address these concerns, to make sure that your project really is going to likely get these permits? So I'll wrap up with what are next steps from here and leave some time for Q&A. As you mentioned, the Q&A document, question and answer document, is under development. Please send in your questions by the end of the month, preferably, and we can update the Q&A document over time if we receive future questions. But we'll get started working on this next month, the responses to your questions and posting that. Again, this training is being recorded. We'll post the recording both at our YouTube channel and on our grants landing page. We mentioned the VDHP training. We'll do another follow-up project review training specifically around the natural resource impacts thing, but also maybe more broadly understanding the eligibility criteria and the screening form and the best uses of those and how you can bake that into your project planning. I think there's also some trainings being planned around new reporting. We're doing some updates. We're transitioning a lot of our reporting forms from Excel sheets or PDFs over to A&R Online, what we affectionately call N-forms. And so there was a training yesterday on the new project form, and those trainings are being recorded if you're unable to attend those, but we'll continue to announce those on our grants notification listserv. The link to sign up for a grants notification listserv will be in the chat. Thank you, Rachel. And then we're, of course, keeping our running list of future updates to the funding policy, which starts immediately after this funding policy is posted. But some things just for your contextual awareness. The Vermont Division for Historic Preservation review section is, for anyone who's been here before, is very new to our program. We developed this in partnership with VDHP, and we're really considering this a pilot year. There's a lot to learn in terms of the implications for this on our projects. So we will be meeting and debriefing with them and seeing what might need to change in the process after this pilot year. And then the other piece to flag for you all is Act 154, or the EJ bill that was passed last year, does have some standard language that will be directing investments proportionately to environmental justice focused populations. That guidance of how that's going to work to different funding programs is still under development, but as that is passed down, that will probably be integrated into our funding policy and our guidance out to project proponents and funding program administrators, not just which projects are eligible, but how they should be prioritized to focus on environmental justice focus communities. And then the last piece is, if you are not on our grants notification listserv, please do sign up for it if you're interested in getting updates on trainings and funding policy updates and all of these pieces. The clean water conversations are usually announced through our broader stakeholder listserv, so you may have heard of it through there, but we do have 2 listservs. So just flagging if you're not on the grants notification one to please join it if this is of interest to you. So I'll stop there. So thank you so much for your time, and happy to take questions here, and we will try to also, if we can't answer them today, take note of them and put them in the Q&A document.
We do have a few questions in the chat, but first, it looks like some people couldn't see the slides changing, and for some reason, I cannot share the file in the chat. So instead, I will share the slides in a follow-up email, and I will also get those out as soon as I will get that out as soon as possible. But yeah, we do have some questions. So
I'm sorry about that.
No problem. First question, do private roads and driveways need to meet any criteria that ensure that irresponsibly constructed roads and driveways? This seems like a potential giveaway to entities that construct poorly sited roads and driveways.
Sure. I mean, that's been sort of the long-term give and take with the private roads and driveways piece, whether we wanted to make investments there or not. A lot of our projects are located on private property. We do stream bank restoration work that can help mitigate against flood erosion damage. So we had some dialogue internally about what is unique to private roads and driveways that maybe is not already happening on other projects that we fund and support. And I think ultimately we're hearing a lot from partners that there's a lot of sources of sediment and nutrient coming from these private road networks. We're not expecting sort of We provide a list of eligible project types, but there's certainly still the additional layer of how these projects are prioritized and in competitive grant environments. And we are not expecting a single project on someone's unmaintained private driveway to really be competitive in terms of it providing a lot of benefits to the community. So we're seeing that there are other ways that we could make sure that the right private road and driveway projects sort of get selected and funded, and those are the ones that are really showing a strong impact on water quality and really have that, you know, community buy-in and a strong partner and a well thought out project plan. So that was some of the reasoning towards broadening that eligibility.
When is the historic preservation review webinar? One person asked.
It'll be March 8th, and I believe it's 2 to 3:30. Oh dear.
That's right. Yeah, it's 2 to 3:30.
Yes, thank you. And we will share around, if we haven't already, the link, the sign-in link, the Teams link for that as well.
Next question. Are we currently able to apply for the MS4 Community Formula grants, or is that coming up in the future?
Oh, great. Yeah, so the MS4 Community Formula grants are largely receiving American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and those, any grant program in the Agency of Natural Resources or across the state that are receiving American Rescue Plan Act dollars need to be sort of the design of the program needs to be reviewed by the Agency of Administration. So we've pushed up the chain. The grant program has been tentatively designed. We've pushed up the chain for review on that, and we'll be meeting with the MS4 communities next month to let you all know, if you're on this call, what our budget is looking like, how we're designing this. It'll be a formula grant of some sort, and we'll give you some more information on that. We're envisioning the funding being available May or June and released directly to those MS4 communities.
Someone asked if you could speak again about educational support. All I find in the policy is E&O for WWTF operators. Is there other support for E&O?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question. And a point of clarification is that we provided more information in the funding policy that is of an educational nature and not necessarily speaking to what is funding E&O work. There, we are exploring outside of the funding policy, you know, in our spending plan, we have other funding initiatives that we support. One of them is a line item for capacity development for clean water partners. And we did an assessment last summer about what are some of the capacity needs of our partners on the ground and what would be needed to help accelerate, you know, implementation of clean water projects. And so we heard from folks that E&O is underfunded. We heard from folks that they need to be able to staff up. So we're in the process of designing that grant opportunity that exists outside of the funding policy. It may have some educational and outreach opportunities in it. That is still to be decided, but we're hoping to release some funding opportunities in the coming months for that.
Someone asked if you could speak again about program staff needing to be consulted but not required for permitting reviews.
Yeah, sure. I do want to speak on that, and I think I want to flag it as that's our second chapter. The VDHP training will be this. It's a lot. It's a lot to discuss and unpack and an answer here. I think the short answer is there's a lot of expertise held with the programmatic staff, and we really want to make sure that that expertise is still used and tapped into. You know, our own staff, the watershed planners rely on them from the program to get whether a project is a good idea or not. So There's still a really strong emphasis and encouragement for partners to be engaging. It's a required milestone in some of these project types. But there was also dialogue about how hard and complex it was to get a project even past this first hump of like, is it even eligible? Can we even apply for funds? And so that's sort of the short in a nutshell, which we can really unpack in a future training, but that's why it was a focus on the permit piece, because the A&R permit programs are really focused around mitigating natural resource impacts. If these projects can be designed to be aware of these permit needs and make sure that they'll meet those permit needs, then that would meet that eligibility requirement.
Here's another question. Are there guidelines on funding co-benefits? What counts, what doesn't, the amount, etc.? For instance, do those co-benefits need to be water quality and watershed health related, not say co-benefits for economic growth or recreation, etc.?
We did not speak further about the guidelines of co-benefits in the funding policy. Individual grant programs have additional guidance. For example, the water quality restoration grants that clean water service providers are managing have a guidance document that talks about a whole suite of co-benefits that are suggested considerations. Each individual basin water quality council and clean water service provider are developing sort of their region's prioritization schema, which includes like what co-benefits they're going to include, and they do not all have to be clean water focused. And so again, that points to sort of the importance of understanding that we're at the state level, we're creating a policy that sort of applies to all of our grant programs, but if you're applying to a specific grant program, there might be more information you would need to gather. And so those have some guidelines. Water quality enhancement grants have some statutory goals that we have traditionally considered co-benefits, for example, public use and enjoyment and resilience. I'm blanking on the terms, but the enhancement summary document provides a bit more guidance about what that might actually mean in terms of signage or condensed access to different natural resources. So I would say it's program by program right now.
Would septic system replacement along lakes ever become an eligible project type in future years?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had conversations with when we were developing the water quality enhancement grants program, what to make an eligible project type, and we as a group decided to rely on our existing eligible project types for the time being, but septic upgrades have come up repeatedly of interest. There are currently it's not there. There are some private grants or public grants and also financing opportunities for those project types, which is why, the Clean Water Initiative program has sort of leaned away from them. But it's hard to speak to whether they will become an eligible project type in the future. There's a lot of steps for projects to become project types in terms of, what are the metrics we're measuring? Can we do this? Can we fund it? So it's hard to read the crystal ball there, but we certainly have heard that request.
Next question. The funding policy applies to funding at all levels, correct?
Funding at what? Sorry?
The funding policy applies to funding at all levels, correct? Those applying for project development funds would still need to do the permit review, historic preservation review, etc.
Yeah, the funding policy applies to all phases of the project, but there is sort of a new section that is which eligibility criteria apply per phase, recognizing that assessment work and project development work aren't necessarily as far along in what information they have. I have to go back and check the policy. I don't actually think the natural resource impacts screening is required for project development phases, but it is a paragraph or two right after all the eligibility screens that will confirm which screens apply for those earlier phases.
Another question, are current block grant holders updating their application materials to require these screenings, or are they still under the previous funding policy?
Yeah, I think talk with your block grant holder. We have a couple different block grants that are open. The most recent one I checked was the design implementation block grants, and those are held to the State Fiscal Year 21 funding policy. So we have communicated to the block grant holders. They are expected to follow the 21 policy. If they like things in the fiscal year 23 policy, they can follow them, but they need to follow the whole funding policy and not pick and choose from both. So that's the guidance we've provided and left it up to the funding program administrators, which policy they'll apply if they're issuing another round.
I believe you mentioned social media posts as a product of work. Do social media posts about CWIP funded projects require DEC review / pre-approval? For example, some language in the CWIP agreements would, if passed down to subgrantees, make this seem necessary.
Should follow up with me what language you're thinking in the funding policies indicating that would be necessary. We've never asked to review media posts before. We just asked it as a deliverable. Or we've never asked for social media posts, but other, not PR, I'm sorry. Letters to editor, notes to the newspaper. We've never asked for reviewing those in advance.
And that was the last of the questions.
Great. Any others for hands up? Claire.
Hi, I was really struggling how to put my question into the chat, going back and forth. So I think it's easier just to say it out loud. So I know there's been a lot of discussion in some of the guidance for enhancement grants and for formula grants about the distinctions between grants and contracts. And I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this funding policy and bringing that in alignment with existing guidance from the Agency of Administration. There is a section towards the end of the policy that says that contractors and subcontractors are not generally responsible for compliance with CWIP program requirements beyond those included in the contracting language. And I was hoping you could maybe speak a little bit about that. The way I read the funding policy is it's a lot about determining project and expense eligibility, sort of regardless of what kind of entity ends up implementing it at the final end. So I'm wondering if you could maybe clarify a little bit about what that language is getting at.
The language is trying to interpret the AOA, the Agency of Administration Bulletin Guidance of contract work grants, and make it really fit for our program. So, our understanding from the Agency of Administration and communicating with the DEC business office is the nature of the agreements and what is expected of contractors versus grantees. And really, grantees are given some leeway in programmatic decision-making and subgrantees. And so when we set a policy, we say you have some leeway in how you design and move forward for this, but you need to follow the policy. And contractors, it is expected that anything that they're going to do is very explicitly written into their contract. So, it's possible that if a project implementer wants their contractor that they've hired, their yellow machine to follow everything in the funding policy, they would write it, but it needs to be written in a way that for everyone else, it doesn't necessarily need to be written in the sub agreement for it to really apply. So that was our best way at trying to get at that, and it may not be the clearest. We can certainly work on improvements in future years to clarify that distinction. Does that help?
I think it does. So I guess under this current guidance or this current policy, it would be incumbent on the enhancement grant holder or the formula grant holder to write to write language to the contractor that follows the funding policy guidance, essentially.
Or that oversees the expenses being, billed by the contractor and saying yes or no, and making sure that the contractor understands, it's really the grantee or the sub-grantees to understand our funding policy and our programmatic expectations and to make sure that those things are being spent in alignment.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Lynn.
Other question.
I guess I just had I had the same question, so I'll just say that I do think maybe it would help to clarify the language, that it's not saying that contractors could go against what is in the policy, but rather that is meant to be stipulated in a subcontract agreement. Because right now it could be read like they don't need to follow the policy. They could do, activities that are ineligible or, not follow what's in the policy. And it's more that I hear what you're saying, that those need to be set out in the contract rather than open to interpretation. So maybe just changing the language to make that a little clearer.
Okay, thank you for that flag, and we will we'll make that clarification in the Q&A document, which we see as a companion document with the policy. Other questions? Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Gianna, for speaking about the funding policy. I hope everybody has a good rest of their day, and I will send that follow-up email out soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.